Jackson Walker felt surprisingly calm from the very morning, despite the fact that this day was, perhaps, the most important in his life. He was always a person who knew how to keep his emotions under control, but today, despite the excitement, he had a feeling that everything was going as it should. Sunlight broke through the thick crowns of the trees, illuminating the alley that led to the altar. Around the alley, chairs were placed for guests, decorated with white ribbons and flowers. The atmosphere around was as if created to witness real magic. Guests had already begun to gather, quietly whispering, waiting for the ceremony to begin. Everyone was waiting for the very moment when Emily would appear in her dress and walk down the alley to meet her future husband. Jackson stood at the altar looking from the guests to the house where Emily would be. He tried to hide his nervousness, although the slight trembling in his hands gave it away. It wasn't fear or doubt that made him uneasy. He was sure of his feelings for Emily, but the knowledge that this day would change his life forever made his heart beat faster. Friends and family looked at him, supporting him with friendly smiles, and this calmed him a little. Jackson looked perfect, his black tuxedo tailored to his body and his white shirt accentuating his athletic form. He has always been a man who values order and attention to detail, and this day was no exception. Jackson carefully chose every element of his outfit to ensure he would be at his best for this important moment. Among the guests were his parents, sister, school friends, and even some colleagues. They all knew Jackson as a reliable and loyal person who always helped others, and today they came to support him in one of the most important decisions of his life. On this day he was going to become a husband, and no one doubted that his marriage with Emily would be long and happy. Mark, Jackson's best friend, walked up to him, lightly patting him on the shoulder. He said quietly, "You can handle it, brother. Everything is going as it should." Jackson nodded, smiling back. Mark had always been not only a friend to him, but also a person who knew how to support him in difficult times. They had been inseparable since childhood, and Jackson could not imagine this day without him. Meanwhile, back home, Emily stood in front of her bedroom mirror, where her friends were helping her with the finishing touches. Her wedding dress was a dream come true, dainty, with lace accents that hugged her figure perfectly. Her blonde hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her light makeup gave her face a soft glow. But despite all the glitter on the outside, there was chaos inside. Emily looked at her reflection and thought about how much her life would change after this day. Emily wasn't just a nervous bride, she was desperate. The secret she'd been hiding all this time was too big to ignore. She knew that with every step down the aisle, with every word she spoke, she was getting closer to the point where the truth would become too much to bear. Emily felt her breathing become heavy and her heart pounding like a drum. Her hands shook as she adjusted the jewelry in her hair. She knew Jackson loved her, but that love was based on her secret. Emily had long wanted to come out as trans, but she was afraid. She wasn't sure Jackson would be able to understand and accept her for who she really was. This fear gripped her soul, giving her no peace for a minute. "You look amazing," one of her friends said quietly, helping to secure the last element of the dress. Emily smiled back, though it was a strained smile. Her friends didn't notice what was happening to her because for everyone she was the perfect bride, the embodiment of femininity and tenderness. No one except herself knew that beneath this outer appearance lurked a story that could destroy everything. Emily's father, a tall, white-haired man, knocked on the door and walked into the room, smiling at his daughter. He had always been her rock, and today his support was especially important. He walked up to her and took her hand. "Ready?" he asked quietly, looking at her with pride. Emily took a deep breath and nodded. She knew this was the moment to take no action, and she tried to push down her anxiety. Together, they left the room and began to walk down the stairs. They were waiting at the bottom. The alley was decorated with flowers and ribbons, and it looked like a scene from a romantic movie. But for Emily, the walk was like walking through a fog. Every step was harder and the fear was growing. When they walked outside, Jackson looked up and met her gaze. He looked so happy and confident that their future would be bright. It made Emily's heart clench even more. She knew Jackson loved her, but it was a love built on a false pretense. He never knew the truth about her past, and she was afraid that it would ruin everything. The guests turned to look as Emily started walking down the aisle. Her white dress touched the ground softly, and the sun's rays played on the fabric, making her look almost unreal. All eyes were on her, but she didn't see it. Her eyes were on Jackson, who stood at the altar, waiting for her with love and devotion. Her father walked next to her, and his support gave her a little confidence. But with each step down the aisle, her heart beat faster. Jackson couldn't take his eyes off Emily. He saw her as the epitome of perfection, and nothing could ruin that moment. As she came closer, he smiled, taking her hand, feeling its softness and warmth. But Emily knew that her touch hid fears she couldn't put into words. Her secret was always with her, and she was afraid that soon everything would change. The solemn moment continued as they stood side by side, exchanging glances. Jackson stood at the altar, looking at his bride Emily, and his thoughts slowly began to take him back to the day they first met. Memories came flooding back, immersing him in the story of their love. It had been a long road, full of unexpected turns and deep emotions that had led them to this moment, to the moment when they stood on the threshold of a new life. 5 years ago, Jackson first saw Emily in one of the small cafes in the center of their city. He was busy with his work then, having just received a promotion to an engineer at a local construction company. Work took up almost all of his time, and he had almost no chance for a personal life. But that day, when he went to the cafe for lunch, everything changed. Emily was sitting at one of the tables, holding a book in her hands. Her long, dark hair fell softly over her shoulders, and her eyes were focused on the pages. Her face was bright, almost angelic, with a slight smile that appeared every now and then when she found something amusing in her book. Jackson couldn't take his eyes off her. He didn't know what it was about her that attracted him, but he felt like he just had to meet her. She looked so calm and confident that he was immediately convinced that she was special. Approaching her table, he coughed awkwardly and offered her a cup of coffee, to which Emily, slightly embarrassed, agreed. This was the beginning of their relationship. At that moment, Jackson did not even suspect that this meeting would change his life. They began to talk about books, art, music. It turned out that they had many common interests. Emily amazed him with her intelligence and breadth of knowledge. She easily supported any conversation and always had her own unique opinion. Several months passed and their relationship began to develop rapidly. Jackson felt that he had found the woman with whom he was ready to spend his whole life. She was his inspiration, his support, his true friend. Every meeting with her brought him joy and new emotions. Emily, in turn, appreciated his reliability and sincerity. Her previous relationships did not work out, and she was afraid to open up to someone again, but Jackson managed to win her trust. Over time, Jackson began to notice that Emily was sometimes thoughtful. Something was bothering her, but she always hid it skillfully behind a smile. He did not attach much importance to this, thinking that it was just a part of her character, perhaps a hidden part that made her even more mysterious and attractive. There was no room for misunderstandings in their relationship. Everything seemed perfect, and Jackson was ready to take the next step. He remembered how he had decided to ask her to marry him. It had been a hot summer, and they had gone on holiday to the mountains. There, on top of one of the cliffs, he had pulled out a ring and, looking into her eyes, had said the very words that would change their future. "Emily, you are everything I have ever wanted in this life. You make me a better person, and I cannot imagine my life without you. Will you marry me?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she had said yes with a smile through her tears. It was a moment Jackson would never forget. The memories of that day were so vivid that he felt a warmth spreading inside him. These emotions helped him forget the excitement that had taken hold of him that morning. He loved Emily with all his heart, and looking at her today, he was sure that they were made for each other. However, the more Jackson thought back on their relationship, the more he began to be bothered by certain details that he hadn't noticed before. Emily had always been a bit reserved, and although they were close, she never talked about her childhood or past. When he tried to ask her about it, she always went off topic or was vague, turning the conversation to something else. At the time, Jackson didn't pay attention to it. He was more interested in the present than the past. He believed that if Emily wasn't willing to share these details, she had a good reason for it. But now, on their wedding day, the memories of those moments began to make him feel a little uneasy. He remembered how Emily had gotten a strange call one day while they were driving. She had gone outside to talk, and when she came back, she seemed worried. Jackson had asked if everything was okay, but she had said it wasn't important and wouldn't explain further. He had decided not to press her then, but now it had surfaced in his mind, raising new questions. Jackson wondered if there was something Emily hadn't told him, but he pushed those thoughts away. He knew their love was real, and everything that had happened between them over the years couldn't be a lie. He was sure that today they would start a new chapter in their lives and there would be no secrets left between them. Maybe he had asked too much of her, and these doubts were simply the result of nerves and a stressful day. Jackson remembered another time when they were at a party at his friend's. One of his acquaintances, slightly drunk, said something strange about Emily being so different. Jackson had shrugged it off at the time, thinking it was just a stupid joke. Emily had pretended not to hear it either, and they had quickly moved on. But now, on the day of the wedding, the words came back to him. He tried to convince himself that these were just coincidences, that there was no reason to worry. But the more he remembered the little details, the more significant they seemed. Maybe it was just wedding jitters. After all, everyone experiences some stress before a big step in life. Jackson looked at Emily, who was already approaching the altar. She looked incredibly beautiful. Her eyes were shining, although in the depths of them he noticed a shadow that he had not noticed before. Perhaps it was just fear before such an important event, and Jackson decided not to attach any importance to it. He was confident in his decision, confident in Emily, and ready to build a future with her. But his memories of those strange moments were still spinning in his head. After the ceremony began, Jackson took a moment to stop his thoughts and focus on the proceedings. The priest began the usual opening words, and the guests, seated on the white chairs, stood waiting, quietly talking among themselves. Jackson felt Emily's hand tremble slightly in his, and it made him wary. He looked at her and noticed that her face was perfectly composed, but her eyes were tense. It was not the joy he had expected to see at this moment. Suddenly he was overcome by a wave of doubts that he could not understand. He loved Emily, there was no doubt about that, but something hidden, inaccessible to him, was now troubling him more and more. He had always believed that he knew her better than anyone, that there were no secrets between them. But now his own mind was beginning to search for answers to questions that he had not dared to ask before. Emily's past was a blur to him. Every time the conversation turned to her childhood or youth, she would skillfully deflect the topic, shifting the focus to something else. It had never seemed suspicious until today. Jackson thought that perhaps her past was too painful to discuss. He didn't want to push her, and as a person who respected her privacy, he didn't insist. But now, these blank spaces in her biography were starting to make him uneasy. He remembered how, soon after they met, they were talking about a past relationship. Emily had said that she had never been in a long-term serious relationship before him. Her voice shook as she said it, but Jackson had dismissed it as nervousness. Now, he wondered if there might be some untold truth behind it. Some time had passed since they had started planning for the wedding. planning the ceremony, meeting relatives, buying a dress, preparing for the celebration. All of this distracted them from any anxious thoughts. But sometimes in the evenings, when they were alone, Emily became distant, immersed in her thoughts. Jackson asked her several times if everything was okay, but she invariably answered with a short yes, without adding anything more. He did not want to insist and accepted her silence as part of her personality because she had always been a little mysterious. He thought that with time she would open up completely, but now this mystery frightened him. Things got even more intense when Emily seemed particularly nervous just a few days before the wedding. They were discussing the final preparations for the wedding when she suddenly went silent and a look of worry crossed her face. Jackson then asked, "Emily, is there something you want to tell me? Are you not happy with the way the preparations are going?" She glanced at him, smiled slightly, and replied, "No, I'm fine. Just nervous." Her smile seemed unnatural, and although he understood that everyone was nervous before a wedding, this moment left an unpleasant mark on his soul. He tried to forget about it, explaining to himself that tension before such an important event was normal, but now these memories surfaced again as something more significant. Jackson also remembered that a couple of days ago Emily had gone out to meet a friend, saying that they needed to discuss the last details of a bachelorette party. She hadn't returned until late in the evening, and when she came into the house, her face was pale and her eyes were red as if she had been crying. Jackson noticed this right away, but decided not to bring it up at that moment, thinking that perhaps there had been a fight or some other problem between the friends. He hugged her carefully, asking if everything was okay, but she just nodded and asked for some time alone. Even then, he had a feeling in his soul that something was happening that he couldn't understand. That night, Jackson couldn't fall asleep for a long time, wondering why Emily had suddenly pulled away from him. He kept returning to their relationship, trying to find an explanation for her behavior. She had always been sincere with him, or at least he thought so. But what if she had some secret that she was afraid to tell him? Now, standing before her at the altar, he felt that tension again. Her hand, still trembling in his, seemed a symbol of the unknown force that hung over them. It seemed wrong to him, but he couldn't figure out why. Jackson wasn't a man who easily gave in to paranoia, but his own thoughts were beginning to pull him deeper into the abyss of doubt. He began to notice little things that had escaped his attention before. Why did she talk so rarely about her family? Why did she have almost no photos from her childhood? She always explained it by saying that she moved from place to place and simply did not have many things from her past. Jackson had taken her words for granted then, without asking unnecessary questions, but now it seemed strange. Emily was an amazing woman. Her beauty, intelligence, and kindness had captured his heart from day one. But now he began to wonder if he had missed something important. Perhaps he had been so blinded by her attractiveness and their shared interests that he had missed something obvious. The priest continued the ceremony, but his words were just background for Jackson. He no longer heard them because his mind was completely immersed in his own thoughts. He tried to remember everything that could give him some kind of answer to the questions that suddenly arose in his head. Every look, every word Emily now seemed to him a riddle that he could not solve. But despite all these doubts, he was sure of one thing. He loved her. Even if she had some secret that she was hiding from him, it couldn't ruin their relationship. Or could it? Jackson stood in the hall, surrounded by friends and family who had come to celebrate his big day. But thoughts kept playing in his head that he couldn't stop. All the strange things, the mysterious moments in Emily's behavior and her past which she rarely talked about. In an attempt to distract himself from these thoughts, Jackson decided to go outside for some fresh air and talk to Mark, his best friend. Mark was not only his friend since childhood, but also the person Jackson always trusted with his thoughts, even the most personal ones. They had been through a lot together, starting in high school, and their friendship had remained strong throughout all those years. Mark knew him better than anyone, and if Jackson wanted to confide in anyone, it was him. They were standing on the terrace of the mansion, overlooking green hills and flowering trees. The air was crisp, and a gentle breeze gently swayed the leaves. The party was going on around them, the guests were chatting and laughing happily, but Jackson was deep in thought. Mark, noticing his mood, was the first to break the silence. "You don't look so good for a man who is about to become a husband. Is something wrong?" Jackson smiled, trying to hide his excitement, but Mark knew him too well not to notice that something was wrong. "No, it's okay, just nerves, you know. This day was so long, so much preparation, and it all fell on us at once." Jackson tried to speak confidently, but he himself felt that he was not being completely honest. Mark looked at him more closely, frowning slightly. "Nerves? I know you, Jack. You're the kind of person who can handle any situation, no matter how difficult. You've always been calm and collected. What's going on?" Jackson paused for a moment, wondering if he should open up. But in that moment, he realized that maybe he really needed to share his thoughts with someone who could help him make sense of this situation. "Honestly, Jackson began, but his voice wavered. He paused again, trying to find the right words. "Something with Emily?" Mark guessed. Jackson nodded. He took a deep breath and finally decided to tell. "I don't know how to explain it. It's just, lately I feel like there's something I don't understand. She's always been a bit mysterious, you know, not very open about her past. I never pushed. I thought it was her personal business, and if she wasn't ready to share, then that's okay. But the closer the wedding day gets, the more I start to think that maybe there's something she's hiding from me." Mark listened attentively, without interrupting. He knew that Jackson rarely doubted people, especially those he loved. "A couple of days ago, she came home late, and I noticed that she was crying. I asked her what was wrong, but she said that everything was fine. But I felt that something was wrong. And then I started remembering all those moments when she avoided talking about the past, when her behavior seemed strange. And now I have these thoughts. They do not give me peace." Mark thought for a second, then nodded slowly. "You know, Jack, I always thought Emily was, how can I put it, special. And not in a bad way, but there's just something about her that's hard to explain. But you always seemed so happy with her that I never even thought about her past. Maybe she's just had a hard life and doesn't want to talk about it." Jackson considered Mark's words. He had never thought of Emily as unusual in the way his friend had described. Yes, she was private, but that didn't make her any less loved. "Do you think I'm exaggerating?" Jackson asked, trying to figure out if he had created a problem out of nothing. "Maybe," Mark answered carefully. "Or maybe you're just nervous about the wedding. That's normal. But if you really have doubts, why not talk to her right now? Maybe she's just afraid of something, or there's something she's hesitant to tell you. But if you're going to build a future together, there can't be any secrets." Those words made Jackson think. He knew Mark was right. If he wanted their relationship to last, he needed to be open about any doubts. But how could he approach Emily with these questions on their wedding day? What if it ruined everything? Maybe he really was just overreacting, and it would be simpler than it seemed. "You're probably right," Jackson replied quietly. "Just talk to her." But inside, he still felt uneasy. He knew that talking to Emily might reveal the truth, but he was also afraid that the truth might be too painful. The wedding ceremony was approaching its peak. The guests were happily watching the proceedings, and the atmosphere around was filled with joy and anticipation. However, Jackson, although he tried to appear calm, could not get rid of the anxious thoughts that continued to spin in his head. He still could not find answers to the questions that tormented him, and despite Mark's advice to talk to Emily, he was afraid to do it now when they were already standing at the altar. Too much was at stake. Emily, standing next to him, looked pale. She was visibly nervous, and Jackson could feel it. Her gaze was directed downwards, and the hand he was holding was cold and shaking slightly. This behavior made him even more nervous, and he instinctively squeezed her hand, hoping that it would calm her down. However, instead of relaxing, Emily only tensed up even more. The moment of truth was approaching. As the priest asked the couple to exchange vows, Emily suddenly hesitated, her face turning even paler. She looked at Jackson, and he saw something in her eyes that he hadn't expected. It was fear, not just the usual pre-wedding jitters. It was fear of something more serious. Jackson's heart sank with anxiety. "Emily, are you okay?" he asked quietly, hoping she would say that everything was fine and it was just wedding nerves. Instead, Emily froze for a moment, staring at him, and then her face twisted in the throes of an internal conflict. She seemed to be struggling with herself, unsure whether she should take the next step. "Jackson," her voice shook, and it was the first time she had allowed herself to sound so nervous. "I have to tell you something." The words hung in the air, and the guests around him froze, not understanding anything. Jackson felt a cold sweat run down his back. This was what he had suspected for so long, but could not bring himself to ask directly. "What?" he whispered, his voice almost inaudible. Emily looked into his eyes, and there was pain in her gaze. It seemed that she could no longer hide her secret, but she was ready to do anything to tell the truth. The scene that should have been the happiest in their lives was turning into something frightening and unknown. "I wanted to tell you this sooner," she began, and every breath she took was filled with fear. "I was afraid. I didn't know how you'd take it, but you have to know." Jackson froze. Hundreds of scenarios of what this could have been ran through his head, but he wasn't prepared for what he was about to hear. "Jackson, I wasn't always Emily." Her words sounded almost like a whisper, but for Jackson they sounded like a bolt from the blue. Something inside him shifted. His mind didn't immediately process the meaning of what she said. He just stood there, looking at her, trying to comprehend what it meant. Emily continued to speak, but her words sounded far away. "I was born in a different body. It took me a long time to become myself, to find myself. I went through a lot to live the life I want. I hoped I could tell you this sooner, but I was afraid you wouldn't be able to accept it." Jackson felt the ground shift beneath him. He stood before his fiancée, the woman he loved with all his heart, but every idea of who she was beginning to crumble in his mind. She had kept her trans identity a secret from him all this time, and now, on their wedding day, the truth was coming out. You were—" His voice broke off. He couldn't finish the sentence. Emily held back tears, her face contorted with pain and regret. "I wanted to tell you sooner, Jackson, but I couldn't. I was afraid that I would lose you, that you wouldn't understand me." Her words sounded like a plea for forgiveness. Jackson couldn't breathe. Everything he knew, everything he felt was suddenly shattered. He felt betrayed, cheated, but even more shocked that he hadn't seen it before. He loved her, or at least the one he thought he loved. But now his world was upside down. The guests began to look at each other, not understanding what was happening. Someone had already guessed that something had gone wrong, but no one knew what exactly. There was silence all around, and the tension in the air was becoming unbearable. Jackson tried to speak, but he couldn't find the words. He just stood there in front of Emily, stunned, his mind unable to process the information. He felt like his world was crumbling around him, and he had no power to stop it. Emily stood before him, her eyes full of tears, clearly expecting the worst, but prepared for any outcome. She knew this might be the end, but she couldn't live a lie any longer, couldn't hide the truth from the man she loved. Jackson stood there, paralyzed, unable to process what he had just heard. Emily's words echoed in his head, blurred and painful. His breathing became ragged, and his heart felt like it was going to jump out of his chest. He looked at Emily, but he couldn't see her as she had been before. This was the moment when everything he had known and trusted had shattered into 1,000 pieces. His perfect world had been shattered, and in the chaos, he didn't know what to do. Emily stood before him, her face pained and expectant. She knew she should have told him the truth sooner, but her fear of losing Jackson was stronger. Now, at this critical moment, her fears were coming true. She could see the shock and confusion in his eyes, and it made her hurt even more. All she could do was stand there and wait for his reaction, knowing that this moment would determine their future. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Jackson asked, his voice shaking with emotion. His words were quiet, almost a whisper, but there was a depth of pain in them. He wasn't shouting or angry, though a hurricane of emotion was raging inside him. Instead, there was desperation in his words, a sense of betrayal. Emily closed her eyes as if trying to find the strength to answer. Her voice was quiet, almost imperceptible, but every answer she gave was filled with pain and regret. "I was afraid, Jackson, afraid you wouldn't understand, afraid I'd lose you. I wanted to tell you, but I didn't know how." Her words were lost in the sound of her own breathing. She knew that these excuses wouldn't change anything, that nothing would take away the guilt of hiding the truth all these years. Jackson slowly looked away from Emily, trying to hold back the tears. He felt betrayed on the deepest level. Everything he knew about her now seemed false, phony. His love, their relationship, everything was in question. He couldn't understand how she could have lived with him for so long, hiding such an important part of herself. "You say you loved me, but how could you love me and hide it?" His voice was shaking, full of pain and bewilderment. "I thought I knew you. I thought we were honest with each other, but it turns out you were hiding behind a mask all this time." Emily stepped forward, trying to touch his hand, but he pulled back abruptly, and the gesture was like a blow to her. She felt a gap open between them that could not be crossed. Jackson seemed to be moving further and further away, and she knew that with each passing moment their relationship was crumbling. "I didn't want to lie to you," she continued, her voice growing quieter. "But it was a part of my life that I was trying to leave behind. I wanted to be with you, to start over. I was afraid that if you found out, you would reject me, and that was what scared me most of all." The words cut through Jackson like a dagger. He was broken that Emily hadn't trusted him enough to share this. He tried to comprehend what her secret really meant. Everything he knew and loved about her now seemed twisted. "You didn't trust me," he whispered, bitterness in his voice. "Everything we had was based on a lie." Emily couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She knew that everything she had feared had come true. Jackson no longer looked at her as his future wife, but as a stranger who had betrayed him. All she could do was remain silent, knowing that it was too late to change anything. Mark, Jackson's best friend, stood among the guests and noticed that something strange was going on. He moved closer, hoping to intervene if things got out of hand. But he knew this was not his moment. This was the moment of truth between Jackson and Emily. The guests, who had been watching the ceremony with joy, now froze in bewilderment and anxiety. Silence and tension hung in the air, and no one dared even move. No one understood what exactly was happening, but it was clear that the wedding was on the brink of disaster. Jackson, still in shock, took a step back. He needed time to process what was happening, but time was not on his side. His emotions were overwhelming him, and he couldn't stand being here anymore. He felt like he needed to leave, just run away, to process this. He couldn't stay with her, couldn't think about their future when the past had been so devastating. "I have to go," he said, his voice almost mechanical. His feet carried him away from the altar, away from the guests, away from Emily, away from this whole disaster. Emily tried to stop him, but she realized she couldn't. She saw her world crumbling, but she didn't have the strength to change anything. Jackson walked away, feeling his heart break with pain and betrayal. Jackson didn't know where he was going. His feet simply carried him away from the wedding ceremony, away from the crowd, away from Emily. His mind was spinning, full of chaos and confusion. He felt broken, betrayed, as if all those years they had spent together had turned into a lie. He couldn't believe that Emily, the woman he was about to spend his life with, had hidden such an important part of her from him. Everything felt foreign and wrong now. He stopped at an old oak tree that stood at the edge of a clearing not far from the ceremony site. His head was spinning, his breathing was ragged, and he finally leaned against the tree, trying to come to his senses. It seemed to him that everything that was happening was some kind of terrible dream from which he could not wake up. Several minutes passed before Jackson heard footsteps behind him. He knew it was Emily. She followed him, trying to make up for the moments when she could explain herself. He heard her approaching, and despite his inner pain, he had to face her. Emily approached him slowly, as if fearing his reaction, and stopped a few steps away from him. Her eyes were filled with despair and regret. She knew that this conversation could be their last chance to figure out what had happened. "Jackson, please let me explain," she began, her voice quiet but full of emotion. "I couldn't stay silent any longer. I knew this was bound to happen sooner or later, but I love you, and that will never change. I just couldn't tell you sooner." Jackson turned to her, his face twisted in pain and anger. He couldn't hold back his emotions any longer. They had been building up inside him for too long. "How could you?" he cried, his voice shaking with rage. "How could you hide this from me? We were going to get married, Emily. Do you think I wouldn't have a right to know the truth?" Emily winced at his words, her heart aching, and she knew she was losing him. "I didn't know how you'd react," she whispered, barely holding back tears. "I was afraid I'd lose you. I wanted to tell you, but every time I was about to, something inside me stopped me. I knew you loved me, and I hoped that would be stronger than anything else." "More than anything else?" Jackson chuckled bitterly. "You think I could just accept that? You thought you could build our entire lives on a lie? You hid your true identity, your entire history. I didn't know who I was with this whole time. Who are you, Emily?" Her eyes filled with tears, but she tried to control herself. She knew that this moment would be decisive. "I'm the same Emily you loved," she tried to explain. "I'm still the same. My past doesn't define me. What happened to me before we met doesn't change who I am now. I'm the woman you love, and I'm the one who loves you. I've been through a lot to become who I am, and my whole life has been a struggle to be true to myself." Jackson froze, her words cutting through him like a sharp knife. He stood before her, trying to process everything she had said. There were still too many questions in his head, too much pain and rage. He couldn't just forgive her for hiding this part of her life. But at the same time, he felt that his own love for her still lived somewhere deep inside. "But how can I trust you?" he finally asked, his voice shaking. "How can I believe that things will be different now? You've kept this from me for so many years. How can I trust you again?" Emily took a step closer, but she didn't dare touch him. She knew Jackson wasn't ready for that yet, but there was still hope in her heart. "I know this can't be fixed overnight," she said quietly. "I know I've lost your trust. But Jackson, I love you, and everything I did was out of fear of losing you. I know that's no excuse, but it's the truth. I want to be with you. I'm willing to do anything to prove my love and honesty to you." Jackson closed his eyes, his heart beating too fast. He knew there was a break in their relationship that couldn't be ignored. He loved her, but could he forgive her for this betrayal? Could he live with this truth? Could he go back to the way things were before? "I need time," he finally said, opening his eyes and looking at Emily. "I can't make decisions now. I don't know what to do." Emily nodded, knowing that was the best thing she could hear at the moment. She knew Jackson hadn't left her for good, but their future was up in the air. It all depended on him accepting her for who she was, despite her past. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I'll wait. I'm not asking for your forgiveness right now, but I hope that one day you can forgive me." They stood in silence, and time seemed to slow down. Jackson walked away from the scene of their confrontation, the weight of the words literally weighing on his shoulders. He headed toward his car, trying to ignore the guests who were watching his abrupt departure with surprise and alarm. He felt like he was in a fog, his thoughts jumbled and his emotions overflowing. Outside, the weather was clear and sunny, but inside, there was a storm raging that he couldn't seem to calm. He got into the car but didn't start the engine. Instead, he just sat there, his hands on the steering wheel, breathing deeply. His heart was beating so fast it felt like it was going to burst out of his chest. 1,000 questions swirled in his head. How had he not noticed this before? How could she have hidden it for so many years? Could he forgive her and continue on with their life as they had planned? He spent several minutes in complete silence trying to compose himself. Everything he knew about Emily was now in question. Jackson recalled their first meetings, their romantic moments, their plans for the future together. Each of these episodes now seemed distorted, false, as if there had always been a dark truth hidden beneath the surface of their relationship. And now that truth was tearing their bond apart. One of the main thoughts that did not leave him was why she hid it for so long. He always believed that there were no secrets between them, that they could talk about everything. He considered their relationship strong and sincere, but now it seemed that all this was an illusion. She hid her true nature, her true path from him. But why? Was she so afraid of his reaction, or was it a question of trust? Emily's past was a mystery to Jackson now. He had never asked too many questions about her childhood, her youth, and now it was starting to bother him. Was this a warning he had missed? Perhaps if he had asked more questions, he would have learned the truth sooner. But instead, he had trusted her, and that trust was now broken. Despite all the anger and pain, Jackson felt another emotion inside him: confusion. He loved Emily. That was undeniable. He loved her for her kindness, her intelligence, her ability to support him in the darkest moments. But could he love her the same way, knowing now that she had hidden such an important part of her life? Could he forgive her for this betrayal? He couldn't stop asking himself, what to do next? Jackson knew he wasn't in a position to make decisions right now. He needed time to sort himself out, to process everything that had happened. He couldn't just go back to the ceremony as if nothing had happened. Their relationship would never be the same again, and he wasn't sure he could fix it. Jackson also realized that his feelings were conflicted. On the one hand, he was a loyal man who always believed in the importance of trust and openness in relationships. For him, hiding such a big secret was tantamount to betrayal. But on the other hand, he understood that Emily had gone through great difficulties to become who she was now. He had never known what it was like to live with such a secret, with such fear of rejection. He had never faced such an internal conflict. Jackson's thoughts returned to their conversation. He remembered the real remorse in Emily's eyes. She was clearly suffering from not being able to tell him the truth sooner. He saw how she was tormented by the fear of losing him, and he knew that her fear was real. She hadn't meant to hurt him, but she had ended up doing just that. Jackson continued to sit in the car, pondering what to do next. He felt like he couldn't just give up, but he also wasn't ready to immediately go back to Emily as if nothing had happened. They both needed time to think about their feelings, their actions, and their future. But he wasn't sure if there was enough time to heal such deep wounds. It must have been about 30 minutes before Jackson finally started the car. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew one thing. He needed to get away from all of this for a while, to be alone, to sort himself out, and to try to figure out what to do next. Emily, who had stayed behind at the ceremony, watched Jackson drive away. Her heart was broken, and she knew she had made perhaps the biggest mistake of her life. She couldn't stop him, she couldn't take it all back, but she hoped that when the storm of emotions died down, there would still be a chance. A chance to talk, a chance to try to fix what had been broken. Jackson drove down the road, looking ahead, but his thoughts were far from reality. He needed to understand himself, his pain, his betrayal, and he needed time to decide what to do next. It had been a few days since Jackson had driven away from the ceremony, leaving Emily and all the guests in a state of shock. He had spent that time away from home, alone, lost in his thoughts. He had turned off his phone, not responded to messages, and avoided any contact with friends or family. He needed that time to try to make sense of what had happened and come to some sort of resolution. But even after days of reflection, his heart was still unsettled. Jackson arrived back in town late that evening, exhausted both physically and emotionally. The street their house was on seemed empty and quiet, with only the occasional car passing. He pulled up to the house and sat in the car, looking at the familiar facade of the building. He didn't know what to expect when he walked inside. Emily might still be there, or she might have left, unable to stand the wait. He needed to know if he was ready to talk to her, listen to her, and perhaps try to understand her point of view. Finally collecting his thoughts, Jackson slowly got out of the car and walked to the front door. He reached for the handle but paused for a moment, feeling his heart begin to beat faster. He stood at the threshold as if on the edge of two worlds, a past that could no longer be changed and a future that remained uncertain. As Jackson entered the house, he felt the atmosphere change. The house that had always been a refuge for him, a place where he felt comfortable and confident, now felt empty and cold. He walked through the hallway, heading into the living room where he and Emily usually spent time together. The lights were off, but the room was silent except for his own footsteps. Emily sat on the couch in the semi-darkness, her face illuminated by the dim light of the table lamp. She was clearly waiting for him to return, but her eyes were tired and afraid. The moment she noticed Jackson in the doorway, her eyes lit up with hope, but it was a cautious hope. She knew that their conversation would not be easy, and much depended on what happened in the next few minutes. "You're back," Emily whispered, barely holding back her tears. Jackson slowly came closer, but did not sit next to her. He remained standing in front of her, as if building an invisible wall between them. His face remained serious, and Emily could not understand what he was feeling at that moment. She waited silently, not daring to speak first. It took a few seconds before Jackson finally spoke. His voice was low and even, but there was deep emotion in it. "I don't know what to say," he began, looking at the floor. "I couldn't stop thinking about it all this time, about what happened, about you, about us." Emily hung her head, feeling tears start to form in the corners of her eyes. She knew she had to listen to him, that this was her chance to explain, but fear was keeping her from breathing. "I needed time to process everything," Jackson continued. "I couldn't understand how you could hide this for so long. We were together, building a future, and all this time you kept this secret. I feel like I don't really know you." Emily sobbed, her voice full of pain. "Jackson, I never wanted to lie to you," she said quietly. "Every day I lived with this fear that if you found out the truth, you would leave me. I didn't know how to tell you, but I've always been honest with you about how we feel. I really do love you, and it's never been a lie." Jackson didn't look away, but his heart was torn with conflict. He still loved her despite the betrayal, but could he forgive her? Could he accept her for who she was, with all her secrets? "Love isn't built on secrets," he replied, his voice a little sharper. "We should have been honest with each other. You should have told me the truth before we started planning our life together. I understand you were scared. I understand it was hard, but you didn't give me a choice." Emily raised her head and looked into his eyes, her gaze full of despair. "I know," she said. "I know I made a mistake. But Jackson, you have to understand that I've always been who you knew me to be. My identity doesn't define our love. I'm still the same Emily you laughed with, the one you shared your dreams with. I'm the same woman you loved. Just because I hid parts of my past doesn't mean our relationship was a lie." Jackson took a deep breath, feeling his inner conflict grow. Emily's words rang true, and he could see how much she was suffering because of all of this. But his own feelings were so complicated that he couldn't simply forgive her. He still felt like she had taken away his right to choose. If he had known this from the start, he would have acted differently. But now that the truth was out, he had to face the consequences of that choice. "I don't know if I can ever forgive this," Jackson said quietly, his eyes never leaving her face. "I don't know if I can accept you for who you are now. That's the problem. I loved you, but now I'm not sure I can trust you." Emily couldn't hold back her tears. She knew this was her worst nightmare, and now it was happening. She had lost his trust, and it would be incredibly difficult to regain it. But she wasn't going to give up. "I'd do anything to prove to you that you can trust me," she said, her voice shaking. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness right now, but I'm asking you to give me a chance to make things right. I love you, Jackson, and I can't imagine my life without you." Jackson froze. He didn't know what to say. His heart was beating in his chest as if it was about to burst. Emily stood before him, genuinely asking for forgiveness, and he felt that he still loved her. But the question was, could he overcome this betrayal and start over? Several days had passed since that tense conversation between Jackson and Emily. They had barely spoken since then, each lost in their own thoughts and emotions. The house that had once been filled with laughter and comfort was now a place of tension and alienation. Jackson lived as if on autopilot, avoiding long conversations with Emily, and she, in turn, tried not to impose herself on him, understanding that it would take time to rebuild trust. However, the silence and distance that had been established between them only intensified their inner experiences. Each of them felt lonely, despite the fact that they were in the same house. Jackson was increasingly immersed in thoughts about what to do next. He tried to imagine his life without Emily, but every time he thought about breaking up, his heart sank. The love he felt for her was deep, but the feeling of betrayal did not go away. One evening, when Jackson returned from work, he noticed that the house was quiet. Usually at this time, Emily would be doing something around the house, but today it was especially quiet. He took off his coat and went into the living room, where he saw her sitting by the window. She looked thoughtful, as if lost in her thoughts, unaware of his presence. Jackson paused for a moment, watching her. He knew this moment was inevitable. Their silence had only increased the tension between them, and it was clear to him that it was time to talk again, this time more openly and honestly. He approached her slowly, and when Emily felt his presence, she jumped as if suddenly awakened from her thoughts. "We can't go on like this," Jackson finally said, his voice louder than he'd expected. Emily looked up at him, her eyes tired and sad. "I know," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I understand that you're still angry with me, but please understand that I'm suffering too. I didn't mean for this to happen." Jackson sighed and sat down across from her. His thoughts were a mess, and he still didn't know how to express all the feelings that were overwhelming him. Contradictions raged inside him. On one hand, he was still angry and felt betrayed, but on the other hand, he still loved her and wanted their relationship to continue. "I don't know what to do, Emily," he admitted honestly, looking into her eyes. "I love you, but I feel like you've deceived me. I've lived in ignorance all this time, thinking I knew you, and it turns out you were hiding something so important. How can you expect me to just forget everything and continue living as if nothing happened?" Emily felt her heart clench in pain again. She knew their relationship would never be the same again, but she still hoped for forgiveness. "I'm not asking you to forget," she said quietly. "I know it's impossible, but I'm asking you to understand why I did it. I didn't want to hurt you. I was afraid. Everything I did was out of fear of losing you. I loved you, and I still love you. But I understand that because of my fear, I lost your trust." There was silence between them. Jackson looked away again, trying to find words that could explain his feelings. He felt himself on the edge again, between forgiveness and a final break. "We can't go on like this," he repeated, more calmly. "But I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you. I don't know if I'll ever be able to stop thinking about what you've been keeping from me all this time. It's more than just a secret. It's a part of you I never knew." Emily couldn't hold back her tears. She knew that the only way to restore their relationship was to give Jackson time. She was willing to wait, but she also understood that the outcome of this situation depended on more than just her. "I understand," she answered quietly again. "I can't force you to forgive me. I can only hope that one day you will be able to understand me and accept me as I am. I will not hide anything from you anymore." Jackson looked at her. His eyes still hurt, but not angry. He knew they were both hurting, but he also knew they had to take the next step or their relationship would be ruined forever. These days of silence, of complete estrangement, were not helping. They were only driving them further apart. If Jackson wanted to save what was left of their love, he had to make a choice. Either he gave up on Emily completely and went on his own way, or they both began to rebuild their broken relationship, one step at a time. "I need more time," he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. "I can't say now that everything will be like before, but maybe we can try, step by step." Emily couldn't hold back her tears. Her heart was filled with hope. Although Jackson hadn't given her complete forgiveness, it was a start, the beginning of a journey to restore their relationship. "I'm willing to wait as long as it takes," she whispered, her voice trembling with excitement. Jackson nodded. He knew it would be a long and difficult road, but inside him there was a glimmer of hope that their love could survive. They sat in the living room, in silence again. But this time it was not the silence of estrangement that had separated them for the last few days. It was a silence full of hope and uncertainty, but also a determination to try again. A few weeks had passed since Jackson and Emily had decided to try to rebuild their relationship, step by step. Each of them knew that it would be a long road and that perhaps nothing would work out. But the love that still lived in their hearts encouraged them not to give up. However, with each passing day it became clear that the tension between them still remained. Jackson often found himself unable to relax around Emily. Although he genuinely wanted to give her a chance, a part of him still couldn't forgive her. He tried to keep his emotions in check, but a shadow of mistrust and bitterness grew inside him. Emily, for her part, tried her best to be patient, knowing that everything depended on Jackson. But with each passing week, her hope for forgiveness began to fade. One evening, when Jackson returned home after a busy day at work, he found the house quiet. Usually, Emily would be at the door to greet him or in the kitchen, preparing dinner. But this time, things were different. He felt a slight uneasiness and went looking for her around the house. When Jackson walked into the living room, he saw Emily sitting on the couch, her face tense and her eyes full of tears. She was holding a photo of their first trip together, when they were still happy and nothing had marred their relationship. "What happened?" he asked carefully, sitting down next to her. Emily looked at him and there was a weariness in her eyes that had been building for a long time. She sighed before finally speaking. "I don't know how much longer I can go on like this, Jackson," she said quietly, looking down. "Every day, I feel like something is falling apart between us, like we can't find what used to connect us anymore. I can see that you're trying, but I can also see that you can't trust me anymore." Jackson froze. The words seemed to pierce his heart. He felt the truth of her words, but he wasn't ready to admit it. He felt like if he admitted it, he'd be admitting that it was over. "I'm trying," he said sharply, his voice hard. "I'm trying to trust you again, but it's not as easy as you think. You hid so much of your life from me. It was too much of a shock." Emily nodded, but her eyes remained sad. She didn't want to justify herself again and again. Her explanations were no longer valid since Jackson seemed to be stuck in his pain and couldn't get out of it. "I understand," she said quietly, "but I feel like we've reached a dead end. I don't know what else I can do to make you trust me again." Jackson felt anger begin to boil inside him. It wasn't just frustration. It was the feeling he'd been suppressing all this time, trying to stay calm. He suddenly felt all the emotions that had been building up for the past week starting to come out. "Do you really think I should just forget everything?" he cried, his voice rising. Do you think it's that easy? I wake up every day and think about the things you kept from me. I feel like I've been living a lie. Do you know what that's like? Do you understand what I'm going through?" Emily winced at his shout, tears streaming down her cheeks again. She tried to remain calm, but Jackson's anger was so intense that it scared her. "Jackson, please, I understand your pain." She tried to speak, but her voice was shaking. "But screaming won't help. I'm doing everything I can to fix what I've done." But Jackson couldn't stop himself. All his suppressed feelings came to the surface and he was no longer in control. "All you can do," he protested loudly. "You've already done everything. You've ruined everything we had. Do you think that your mere regret will be enough? Do you think that I can just go and trust you again?" His anger grew with every word. He felt the rage building inside him and he couldn't control it. Emily stood up from the couch, shaking, and took a step back, unsure of what to do. She tried to hold on, but her strength was gone. "Jackson, please calm down," she sobbed. "This isn't going to help. We can't solve our problems by yelling." But there was no stopping him. There was so much pain, so much resentment inside him that he couldn't hold it in any longer. He moved closer to Emily, and she took another step back. "I don't know what else to do," he finally blurted out. "You broke me, Emily. You ruined our future, and I don't know if I can ever forgive you." Emily stood there silently, her face wet with tears, and she no longer knew what to say. These words were like a blow to her. Jackson was no longer trying to control his emotions, and this meant that their relationship had reached the point of no return. The silence hung between them, oppressive and heavy. Jackson looked at her, feeling his rage slowly fading, leaving an emptiness in its wake. He felt empty, as if his emotions had been drained to the last drop, and now he had nothing to say. The silence that followed the outburst was so thick it seemed to fill the entire house. Jackson was breathing heavily, his heart pounding in his chest. Emily stood in front of him, her face wet with tears, her eyes full of horror and pain, looking straight at him. He felt something change inside him, as if all the emotions that had been building up inside him for so long had finally burst out and left him completely empty. But that wasn't the end. It was just a harbinger of something terrible to come. Jackson, shaking with tension, began to realize that he couldn't stay in this house any longer. Every corner, every room now seemed like a place where betrayal had taken place, where everything was falling apart. He took a step back, trying to regain control of his emotions, but his thoughts were too foggy. His mind kept replaying Emily's words, their conversations, her confession, her secret. It all became one big chaos inside his head. Emily, still staring at him, took a tentative step forward. Her hands were shaking. She wanted to say something reassuring, but she couldn't find the words. The fear of his anger was palpable, but inside her there was a faint hope that if she said the right thing, the situation would change. Maybe she could reach Jackson again, reach the love that still glimmered somewhere deep in his heart. "Jackson," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "please, let's try this again. I know you're hurt. I know I broke our trust, but I still love you. I can't lose you. You're everything to me." Her words echoed in the space, but they found no response in his soul. Jackson felt a wave of emptiness wash over him, the same emptiness that comes after shock, when emotions have spilled out, and in their place there is only fatigue and despair. It all happened very quickly. He took another step back, his hand unexpectedly encountering the cold surface of the kitchen table, where a kitchen knife was lying. Jackson, not understanding what was happening, instinctively grabbed the knife, and for a moment his mind seemed to switch off. There was only one thought in his head: to leave this place, to end the pain. Emily saw the knife in his hand and froze. Her face contorted in horror, and in that moment she realized that the situation was out of control. She took another step back, but did not have time to say anything. Jackson's gaze was empty. There was no anger in it, only despair and loss. He did not fully understand what he was doing. His mind was as if clouded. "Jackson," she whispered, her voice shaking. She couldn't believe it had come to this point. This couldn't be real. It was like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Jackson took a step forward, unaware of his actions, the knife in his hand glinting in the dim light of the kitchen. It all happened so fast he didn't even realize what he was doing. He didn't mean to hurt her, but his actions were instinctive, as if his body was moving on its own, following some primal impulse. He heard the knife cut through the air and felt resistance. Emily let out a small cry as the cold blade touched her body. Her hands rose reflexively, trying to cover themselves, but it was too late. Jackson looked at her, but he didn't see her. His mind was somewhere else, where none of this seemed real. It was as if he was watching from the outside, like a spectator, unaware that he was the source of this horror. Emily slowly sank to the floor, her eyes wide with shock. She tried to speak, but her voice was weak. Blood began to slowly spread across the floor, and her breathing became ragged. Jackson, still holding the knife in his hand, stood motionless, not believing what had happened. He looked at Emily, at her face, which was now distorted with pain and fear, and his own heart clenched in his chest. It all happened too fast. He didn't realize what had happened until he saw the blood dripping from his hand. And then the reality hit him with such force that he almost fell to the floor. He let go of the knife, which hit the floor with a thud, and stepped back, shocked by his own actions. There was only one question in his mind. How could this have happened? Emily was still lying on the floor, her body shaking and her breathing becoming shallower. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes were fixed on Jackson, and there was still something human in them, something that was searching for forgiveness and hope. She couldn't believe that this man she loved had done this. Jackson couldn't stay still any longer. His feet carried him away from Emily, away from the house, away from everything. He ran outside, his mind in a complete panic. Everything around him seemed hazy, like he was in some unreal world where his actions no longer mattered. His heart was beating so fast he thought it would stop. He ran, not knowing where. His mind was clouded. His actions were instinctive. He couldn't comprehend what he had just done. His whole world had collapsed, and he was alone on the cold street, without a plan, without a goal, without a way to fix it. Meanwhile, Emily remained in the kitchen of the house, her life slowly ebbing away with every breath she took. Jackson ran through the dark streets, unaware of the night as it engulfed the city. The only sounds in his head were the ragged rhythm of his own breathing and the repeated thought, "What have I done?" His feet carried him forward, away from his home, away from the horror that had just happened. He couldn't stop, couldn't comprehend that this was all real and not a nightmare he could wake up from. His mind was in a turmoil, like a fog. He couldn't put any coherent thoughts together. He felt like if he kept running, all of this would be left behind, like something unreal that could be forgotten. But every step he took was a hard reminder. He had killed Emily, the woman he loved, and that would never change. Hours later, Jackson found himself in a park, sitting on a cold bench. He didn't remember how he got there. His body was shaking from the cold, and his fingers still felt the weight of the knife, even though there was nothing in his hands. He covered his face with his hands and tried to collect his thoughts. All he could see in front of him was Emily's face in her last moments, her frightened eyes filled with pain and confusion. But even as the horror of what he had done began to seep into his consciousness, Jackson didn't know what to do next. It was as if reality had split in two, one part still immersed in his anger and pain, and the other part finally realizing that he had become a murderer. Police cars with flashing lights arrived at the house a few hours after the incident. One of the neighbors heard screams and called the police. When they entered the house, they found Emily lying on the kitchen floor in a pool of blood. Her body was already cold, and all they could do was confirm her death. Bloody footprints on the floor and chaotically scattered objects indicated that a tragedy had occurred here. However, the main question that remained unanswered was, where was Jackson? Police began combing the area, and soon a wanted man was put out for Jackson. The crime seemed obvious. A husband, overcome with anger and resentment, had attacked his wife. The evidence was there, but the suspect had not yet been found. Despite his inner turmoil, Jackson knew he couldn't run forever. He knew they would look for him, and that eventually they would find him. After several hours of restless wandering through empty streets, he knew he had to turn back and surrender. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing: his life would never be the same. Soon a police car found him. He was walking down a deserted street with his head down when the flashing lights illuminated his silhouette. He did not resist. The police stopped, and the officers slowly got out of the car and approached him. Jackson stood motionless, his hands shaking, his face blank. "Jackson Walker?" One of the officers said his name, looking at him cautiously. Jackson nodded without trying to explain. "You are under arrest on suspicion of murder," the officer said, advancing toward him with handcuffs. Jackson didn't fight back as his hands were twisted behind his back and he was handcuffed. He was too drained to feel anything. He didn't fight back as they put him in the police car. For the first time in hours, his mind stopped racing. He knew it was over. At the station, Jackson was taken to a dark, cold cell where he sat alone, staring at his shaking hands. He waited to be called in for questioning. Every sound in the hallway echoed in his head. Now he had enough time to think about what had happened, and the silence was becoming unbearable. A few hours later, he was called in for questioning. 2 detectives sat at a table in the interrogation room, watching him closely. The room was cold, and the bright light from the lamp blinded his eyes. "Jackson," one of the detectives began, "we know what happened to your wife. We know you were there. Now we want to hear your side of the story. What happened?" Jackson was silent for a few minutes, staring at a point in front of him. His mind was clouded and he couldn't find the words. He knew there was no point in denying or defending himself anymore. All he had was the truth, which he himself hadn't yet fully comprehended. "I don't know," he finally said quietly, his voice shaking. "I didn't mean to. I lost control. I don't know what came over me. It all happened so fast." "Lost control?" the detective asked, writing something down in his notebook. "Explain what you mean." Jackson slowly looked up, meeting the detective's eyes. There was no malice in his gaze, only an immense weariness. "We were arguing. She said that I couldn't forgive her, that I could never go back to what had been before. And then I felt as if everything that had been building up inside me exploded. I grabbed a knife, but I didn't want to kill her. I don't know what happened next." Tears began to stream down his cheeks. He felt like a complete failure, a man who had ruined his life and the life of the one he loved. "Was it an accident?" the detective continued, looking closely at Jackson. I don't know," he answered again, his voice almost quiet. "I lost control. I didn't mean to, but I can't change what happened." The interrogation room was silent. Jackson knew that his confession would not absolve him of guilt. He knew that his life would never be the same again. Time seemed to stand still for Jackson from the moment of his arrest. Everything around him seemed distant, as if he were watching his life from a distance. With each passing minute, it became increasingly difficult for him to comprehend that he had actually committed murder. The events of the last few weeks flashed before him in a blur. He sat in his cell, unable to think clearly, while the world outside continued to move. Meanwhile, in the small town where Jackson and Emily lived, news of the tragedy spread quickly. Their acquaintances, friends, and relatives who learned of what had happened were in shock. No one could believe that kind, calm Jackson was capable of murder. Emily had always seemed a friendly, sweet woman to everyone, and their relationship was almost perfect. None of them knew what internal conflicts were destroying their union from within. Emily's family was devastated. Her parents, upon learning of the tragedy, could not believe that their daughter was gone. When they arrived at the house where the murder took place, they saw what was left of the life Emily had built with Jackson. It was hard for them to accept that she was gone, and that Jackson, the man they considered part of their family, was the one who took her life. Emily's mother, Sarah, was overcome with grief. She sat in her car, looking at the house where her daughter had lived for the past few years, unable to hold back her tears. This house had once been a symbol of happiness and hope for the future. She had always supported their marriage, believing that Jackson was a good man who would make her daughter happy. Now, it all seemed like an empty illusion. Sarah recalled how she and her husband had visited Emily and Jackson many times. At those moments, they seemed so happy, a young couple who had everything they needed for a happy life. They talked about the future, about family, about children. But now all these dreams were gone, as if they had never existed. Emily's father, Tom, was better able to contain his emotions, but his inner state was just as shattered as his wife's. He couldn't believe that Jackson, the man he trusted with his daughter, was capable of such an act. He tried to understand what had gone wrong, what mistakes they might have made, and why no one had noticed the signs that could have prevented this tragedy. Tom was a man of action, and his thoughts immediately turned to what needed to be done to bring about justice. The next day, Emily's family gathered to discuss the funeral. It was unbearable for them to plan for their daughter's death, which had been so sudden and cruel. Sarah cried, unable to accept the reality, and Tom, though he tried to be strong, felt the pain tearing him apart inside. No one could have predicted that their lives would change so drastically. All they were left with were memories of Emily and the knowledge that her life had been cut short so tragically. Meanwhile, Jackson's family was also in great shock. His parents, Susan and Richard, were in a state of profound shock when they learned that their son had been accused of murder. They could not understand how their quiet and kind son had become involved in such a terrible crime. Their pain was twofold. On the one hand, they mourned Emily, whom they loved as their own daughter, and on the other hand, they felt incomprehension and despair that Jackson had become a murderer. Susan, Jackson's mother, cried for days in disbelief. She couldn't accept the idea that her son was capable of murder. In her mind, Jackson was still the sweet boy she had raised, who had always been kind to people and never showed aggression. She constantly wondered where she and Richard had gone wrong, why they hadn't noticed the signs that could have warned them that something terrible was happening in their son's life. Jackson's father, Richard, tried to be more reserved, though his grief was no less intense. He felt he had to support his wife and be strong for her, but there was a huge emptiness inside him. He couldn't believe his son had been drawn into such a terrible conflict, and he wondered why Jackson hadn't come to them for help sooner. Jackson also had to face the consequences of his actions not only before the law, but also before his family. His parents, upon learning of his arrest, came to the police station to see him. It was one of the hardest meetings of their lives. When Jackson was brought into the visiting room, Susan could not hold back her tears. She rushed to him, trying to hug him, but his hands were cuffed. "Jackson, how could this happen?" she whispered through tears, looking at her son. Jackson couldn't look her in the eye. He didn't know what to say. All he felt was deep guilt towards everyone, to his family, to Emily's family, to himself. He knew there was no going back to the old life. "I don't know, Mom," he answered quietly, his voice weak. "It all happened too fast. I lost control." Richard stood there, his face grim and drawn. He was silent, but there was deep pain in his eyes. This was not a conversation he had ever thought he would have with his son. "Jackson," Richard finally said, his voice thick with emotion, "you need to tell the police. You need to take responsibility for your actions. We'll support you, but you understand that this is the end of the life you knew." Jackson nodded, speechless. He knew Richard was right. His life would never be the same again. Several months have passed since Jackson's arrest. These months were filled with trials, investigations, and many sleepless nights for both him and the families of Emily and Jackson. All participants in the tragedy lived in constant anticipation of the trial, which was supposed to put an end to this terrible story. The trial attracted public attention, with journalists and locals eager to learn the full details of what had happened. People wanted to understand how a simple, kind guy, as Jackson had always been considered, could commit such a brutal crime. The atmosphere in the city was one of grief and bewilderment. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was crowded with friends, family, and members of the press. Emily's family sat in the front rows, their faces filled with pain. Emily's mother, Sarah, looked haggard with dark circles under her eyes and a drawn face. Her father, Tom, sat next to her, his hands clenched into fists. He was full of anger and pain, which showed through his stern face. They had lost their daughter, and now they wanted justice. Jackson's parents were also in the courtroom. Susan and Richard, exhausted and devastated, sat in silence, watching the proceedings. Susan couldn't help but cry as she looked at her son, who sat in the dock in handcuffs. For them, the day was no less tragic. Their son was facing the terrible consequences of his actions, and they knew his life was ruined forever. Jackson, sitting in the dock, looked exhausted and drained. His face was pale and his eyes were dull from sleepless nights and constant thinking about what had happened. He knew that the trial was the final stage of his decline. He made no attempt to justify himself or shirk responsibility. He had pleaded guilty, but his lawyers had hoped to reduce his sentence by arguing that it was a crime committed during an emotional breakdown. When the trial began, the prosecutor began his testimony, detailing the events of that fateful night. He described how tensions had been building between Jackson and Emily, how she had opened up to him, and then how Jackson had become emotional and attacked her. The prosecutor described Jackson as a man who, despite his outwardly kind personality, was consumed by anger and resentment, which led him to commit murder. Then came the defense. Jackson's lawyers based their defense on the fact that he was in a state of emotional shock, that it was an accident, not a deliberate murder. They emphasized that Jackson had never shown aggression before, and that his actions were caused by a state of severe emotional stress after Emily's confession. The trial lasted for several weeks. Jackson stood up before the court several times and said that he regretted what had happened. He sincerely admitted his guilt, but also said that he did not understand how he had ended up in such a state when he could not control his actions. His voice was quiet, full of remorse, but it could not change the fact he had killed the woman he loved. When it came time for sentencing, the courtroom was silent. The judge slowly rose and began to read his decision. The silence in the courtroom was so great that it seemed as if you could hear everyone's heart beating in tension. Jackson, sitting on the bench, bowed his head, preparing for his life to end the moment the verdict was read. After carefully considering all the facts of this case and hearing the testimony of both parties, the court finds Jackson Walker guilty of murder in the second degree, the judge said, his voice firm and emotionless. The court sentences Jackson Walker to 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The words hung in the air like a bolt from the blue. Jackson's mother burst into tears. Richard sighed heavily, feeling all their hopes for a lighter sentence dashed. Emily's family sat in complete silence. Susan couldn't stop sobbing, feeling that her son was lost to her, but also knowing that this was a just punishment for what he had done. Jackson didn't look up. He accepted the sentence silently, knowing that this was his punishment for what he had done. He knew that 20 years in prison were not only wasted years, but also his opportunity to atone for his guilt before society and perhaps before himself. He would spend many years in prison, wondering how he had gotten to this point, how his life had been destroyed in an instant. As the trial ended, the courtroom slowly began to empty. The families of Jackson and Emily walked out in silence, each lost in their own thoughts and grief. For Emily's family, this was the end of a long road to justice for their lost daughter. But for Jackson's family, this was just the beginning of years of separation and pain. Jackson was taken to a prison cell. He was about to begin a new life of loneliness and remorse. His life was ruined, and now all he had left was the hope that one day, maybe, he would find the strength to move on despite all the horrors he had caused. This story, which began with love, trust, and hope, ended in tragedy for everyone.